Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, which is focused on a newly released report by the Council on Criminal Justice Women's Justice Commission. I'm Stephanie Achter. It's my honor to direct the commission and to kick off and moderate today's session. In just a few minutes, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists. But for those new to our work, the Council on Criminal Justice is a nonpartisan think tank and invitational membership organization. Really, one of our core functions is to assemble diverse groups of leaders to produce policy roadmaps that are grounded in evidence. Now, our work spans some of the most pressing issues in the field, ranging from policing and community violence to long prison sentences, and even opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence for our justice system. Before we dig into today's topic, I want to note that this event is being recorded. It'll be shared on the CCJ YouTube channel. And also that we'll hold time at the end for audience questions. So feel free to type those in. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can type those in at any time during the event. So let's get started with why we're focused on women, despite there being significantly more men in the justice system. And the answer, unfortunately, is that women are making up a growing share of the criminal justice population. So in 2024, most recent data available, women accounted for more than a quarter of all adult arrests. Now, that's twice the share than in 1980. And while we've seen declines in men's incarceration rates, women's incarceration rates have increased over that time. Go to the next slide, please. And what we know is that women's experiences, this from the risk factors that lead them to criminal behavior, to how they move through the justice system, to what helps them succeed after, these experiences often differ from men's in important ways. Women who come in contact with the criminal justice system face distinct and myriad challenges. They often report high rates of unemployment, homelessness, and poverty prior to incarceration. Many are survivors of childhood abuse and domestic violence. They have high rates of mental health disorders, and many use drugs, either to cope with the effects of trauma or untreated mental health conditions. And these realities often tangle together to become the driver of women's criminal behavior. Now, at the same time, women often shoulder caregiving responsibilities, so their involvement in the system can be particularly destabilizing for families. And we know that women generally engage in crime at lower rates than men and pose lower risks of violence and reoffending. So these differences have important implications for public safety strategies. The bottom line is that approaches that work for men may be less effective for women. By better tailoring justice system responses for men, we can prevent crime and strengthen families. Now, to be clear, women should be held accountable for their crimes, just like men. You can go to the next slide. Our commission leadership, whose photos are here, said it well in their cover letters to the report. Former U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, chair of the commission, said women are no less responsible for their actions than men. And Oklahoma First Lady Sarah Stitt, who's serving as senior advisor to the commission, expanded on that point, saying that by pairing accountability with meaningful opportunities for redemption and rehabilitation, we can help break generational cycles of crime and punishment, restore families, and build safer, healthier communities. Go to the next slide, please. Thanks. We launched the Women's Justice Commission last year to get a better sense of both the nature and extent of women's justice system involvement, and to really start to understand how effective the justice system is in responding to women who break the law, and to start to envision what alternatives might look like. Now, at the same time, we've been using our platform to help raise public awareness about the troubling trends that I just described. The next slide, please. We've assembled a powerhouse of diverse leaders, some of whom you'll hear from today, representing law enforcement, courts, corrections, the legislature, medicine, research, community groups. And ultimately, our charge as a group is to comb through the data and the evidence to identify policies that safely stem the growth of women in the justice system and improve outcomes across the board. I'm pleased to share that we issued our first report last week, which examines the distinct factors driving women's involvement in the justice system and calls for 4 priority measures to improve early stage responses, from arrest through sentencing, to promote safety, stability, and family well-being. These are 4 priorities. The list is long of things that we could have taken on. There are many improvements to be made. I just want to note that a second set of recommendations will be released next year, focused on the back end of the justice system, including how to promote success in jails and prisons and upon reentry. So today we're looking at that front end early interactions of the system. Today's webinar is going to focus on why these four areas warrant policy attention and really the practical implications for federal, state, and local leaders. So I am thrilled to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Four members of the Women's Justice Commission. We have Courtney Bryan, CEO of the Center for Justice Innovation, Sheriff Ed Gonzalez of Harris County, Texas, former Kentucky State Senator Whitney Westerfield, and Pamela Wynn, president of Restore Her. To read the report and our panelists' full bios, please click the resources button at the bottom of your screen. And to our panelists, thanks so much for joining today. So I'd like to spend some time hearing from each of you about these recommendations. And I'll ask you to reflect both on why the group felt that these were the most critical issues to take on, but also what it'll take to make them a reality. So Sheriff Gonzalez, I'm going to start with you. The Commission's first recommendation is to prioritize alternatives to arrest and connections to services for women when it's safe to do so. Why is this important? And really, what are we calling on law enforcement agencies to do differently here?
Well, Stephanie, thank you for having me. It's been an honor and privilege to be a part of the commission and with my fellow commission members. It's really been thorough and extensive work to really look at many key policy areas, and we really honed in on a few that we really thought were practical, that made sense, and really could make a positive difference and accomplish better outcomes. But oftentimes we find that women enter the criminal justice system through crisis. Sometimes linked to behavioral health needs, it could be trauma, or it could be domestic abuse. And oftentimes we in the law enforcement community are tasked with having to respond to many of these calls for service, yet our peace officers out there on the field, the boots on the ground, if you will, oftentimes have limited training, limited resources, and just limited options. Oftentimes our main go-to tends to be arrest. And so we have found that there are other alternatives that show promise, and some of those can include just a small sample could be alternative to incarceration, and that could mean like co-responder models, for example. We've seen great success, and we've seen a lot more use of it by the law enforcement community when it comes to mental health and behavioral needs. For example, we'll typically pair a deputy or a peace officer with a trained clinician to respond to 911 calls that could hopefully lead to other options on the table, really with a trained professional that really could go into the underlying issues of what may be causing the crisis or the reason for the call for service. A second option could be perhaps where we do diversion or deflection programs as well when when we're dealing with a nonviolent type situation. Look, I'm law and order, I'm a peace officer. My North Star is always public safety, but I think that one size doesn't always fit all, that we can find successful models for alternatives to incarceration that really could connect services, community-based services, to the person that may be in crisis in lieu of arrest. And again, I always want to preface to say, we're not saying that this is a blanket all the time response, but where certain criteria may apply, then we could try to use these successful alternative to incarceration. And then also we have citations and summons as well, where the person that may be accused of a nonviolent offense, for example, may be able to remain in community and eventually just show up to court to resolve and adjudicate the case before them. So oftentimes in our county jail systems, I operate one of the largest ones in the county. The vast majority of people are here on a pretrial basis. They haven't been convicted of a situation. And again, to me, jail should be a place where we hold those that pose the most serious threat to community, where there's a flight risk. But many times we could look at those risk factors and determine individuals that maybe don't belong in a jail setting necessarily. And so I think we could be creative and see what's working. And generally speaking, research has shown that alternatives to incarceration often lead to recidivism, and seeing improvements with recidivism in terms of people not coming back to jail. And secondly, cost savings. And I don't know of any jurisdiction that has unlimited budget surpluses to be able to spend on anything and everything. So we have to be smart with the dollars that we have and be good stewards of those resources that the public bestows on us. And so it's important as police executives, as leaders in the criminal justice system, to find ways to be more effective. And again, ultimately to keep people safe, but also if we could reduce recidivism and improve lives, to me, that's a win-win across the board. And then
Thank you so
finally,
much. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and then finally, I just want to say that it's important to consider these things because we understand the impacts of incarceration on children. Here in my local county of Harris County, every year, about 90,000 children have a parent that's incarcerated in our jail. And to us, we know that there's a cradle to prison pipeline. We know that oftentimes they are slowly going into a corrections future at some point down the road. And if we could stem the tide and make sure that we're being smarter and more thoughtful, then again, I think it's a win and it keeps our community safer.
Thank you so much, Sheriff, both for your leadership in this space. And I want to come back to in a minute one of the points you raised about connections to community-based services and what that looks like, because we can't rely solely on law enforcement to be able to respond to all of these calls for service. But you also talked about the experiences in pretrial detention. And so I want to turn to Whitney next. There is a lot of attention being paid right now to how pretrial detention decisions are being made and the role of money. And the commission came out strongly on this one with a recommendation to base pretrial detention decisions on public safety risk and on flight risk. Can you tell us more how the group got there?
Absolutely. And I'll share Sheriff Gonzalez's thanks for getting to serve on this committee with this great group of people from all kinds of positions in the criminal justice system. I'm really proud of the work we've already put into it and the work we still have ahead of us. It's interesting that and I'm so thankful that we made this recommendation in this first batch of recommendations that we've done. Uh, just as a reminder, 60% of the women in jail right now are sitting in their pretrial. They are presumed innocent. They are not convicted of a crime. They're sitting in custody, and most of them, a great many of them anyway, are sitting in there because they can't afford to get out. It's frustrating to see that in any particular offender's case, but it's particularly troublesome for women. We've learned, and you just heard from Sheriff Gonzalez talking about their children and the families and the involvement of women in their families and how that factors in for many women. And he also mentioned domestic violence and abuse, sexual assault, human trafficking. There are lots of different circumstances that lead women to the criminal circumstances that they're in. And those sorts of things need to be factored into the decision, not just their ability to pay. It's a careful balance between the public safety interest of the communities that we all live in, and that the courts are charged with preserving, and policymakers are charged with preserving, and the liberty interest of someone who's not guilty of a crime yet. And it's difficult. Having been a prosecutor and then as a policymaker, it's really hard to see past the allegation and realize this person's not guilty yet. And the system needs to recognize and reflect the fact that they aren't guilty yet. Now, that doesn't mean some don't pose enough of a public safety threat that they need to be detained. That's certainly true in some instances. And the system should be designed to account for that and to give judges and prosecutors the ability to weigh in and to keep people detained that genuinely present a public safety threat. But it needs to be based on public safety or their flight risk, not on their ability to pay and to get out. The commission is saying what the research clearly shows that most of the people, most of that population of women in particular, can be perfectly and safely managed outside of the county jails or the city jails that they're in, with community-based programming and supports, with pretrial supervision, the various things that can keep them with their family, can keep them providing for their family, caring for their children. I'll close by saying this. There was a great anecdote shared, and I, for the life of me, Stephanie, can't remember who said this at one of our last meetings, but he talked about how when a man is taken into custody, no one asks or questions where their kid is going or who's going to take care of their kid. But when the mom gets arrested, when mom gets taken into confinement, into custody, man, all things fall apart. there's no one there to look after the child or children, and it ends up being a makeshift hodgepodge effort of neighbors and extended family members or community members trying to make do, and often they can't. And that leads to subsequent problems downstream for that mother, for that child, apart from foster care and other sorts of court interventions that create and introduce still more trauma that we inevitably end up paying for in the system and that family ends up paying for in the system downstream. All of that can be avoided by taking care of things on the front end and providing community-based solutions. And that all starts with a pretrial risk assessment that courts and prosecutors and defense attorneys should use and follow to try to get people back out pre-trial instead of keeping them locked up just because they're too poor to get out.
Thank you so much for that, Whitney, and for your leadership in the commission on this one. Okay, now I've heard Sheriff Gonzalez and Whitney both talk about the importance of these community-based supports, that it's not just the risk assessments alone, that we need to be wrapping around people to address their underlying needs. Courtney, I'm going to turn to you next. Can you tell us what does that look like in practice? How do we provide these wraparound supports at the arrest deflection stage, at the pretrial stage, or in the alternative space? Oh, you're on mute.
There I am. Okay. Thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this incredible work and have just the representation of, as it's been referenced is really makes these recommendations, I think, so common sense in many ways, and to see that there's support from a wide range of stakeholders, I think is so important. So my organization, the Center for Justice Innovation, we are, while we're a national organization working with reformers around the country, we also run programs here in New York City mostly that are delivering alternatives to arrest in some cases, alternatives to prosecution, alternatives to confinement, to detention, and alternatives to jail and prison. And so I think there are two really important principles when I think about what this looks like in practice for our organization and for a number of both government agencies and nonprofits that are in this space. The first principle, again, this is the science, is that really looking at what is the least restrictive, the sort of lightest touch set of conditions, contact with the system, with whether it's supervision or the courts, that are needed to be effective. And effective meaning protecting public safety. And public safety is the wider community, but also, as we have heard, that includes the person themselves. And in this case, the woman who is charged with a crime and her family and her children. So the broad, I think, kind of looking beyond only the community, which is obviously most critical, but looking at what is going to protect this member of our public, which is the woman charged with a crime and her children. And then what is effective, again, what's the sort of least restrictive means necessary to be effective in ensuring that she comes to court, complies with whatever the conditions that are necessary, for that criminal case. So again, the principle of sort of least restrictive to be effective is, again, grounded in the evidence, and I think important in practice. The second is really looking at what are the barriers to the success of this woman. What are the barriers to her particular success, and create the conditions, the supervision, the even the court, interaction, court dates, and what happens, that scheduling, so that she can be successful. That starting from that principle of how do we support this person's success can be a game changer. When you start with that, then you can build the right conditions and supports needed. Research shows that pretrial release, when paired with the right supports, the right supervision, and conditions, that we can effectively manage risk in the community for many people. Looking at women particularly, so in our experience, and this is what we saw, affirmed through the research and findings of our commission's work, is the kind of unique and really critical barriers that women face in being able to be successful. And one, looking at histories of trauma, the substance abuse and physical abuse that they have experienced. And then most importantly, I think that is often forgotten is the current abuse that many of the women who are in our system are experiencing. Sometimes a contribution to why they're in the system in the first place, whether it's duress, committing a crime under duress, or the relationship with men being unfortunately a driver of their involvement, but also that many are ongoing experiencing domestic violence while they are also having their case prosecuted, where they are being prosecuted. And the realities of what that looks like when someone's in supervision when they are a victim of domestic violence. Their unique needs around childcare and parenting. They are often the primary parent, child care provider. How do we build a system that supports that reality and need? And the essential role that women play in the economic security of their lives and their children's lives. Employment and most especially housing. Ensuring that they remain housed or connected to housing, not just for themselves, but again, often for their children. I'll say at the Center for Justice Innovation, this has been critical for us in recognizing as we run pretrial services for the city. One of the organizations, the nonprofits that do that, is recognizing these again kind of unique needs and barriers to success, and then building around that. That could include court reminders, which is good for anybody, but particularly good to reduce the risk of failing to appear and then a bench warrant. Again, to the kinds of support and services that are offered even on a voluntary basis that can address those needs.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And we've now talked so much about these sort of complex circumstances that women face. And throughout the report, we talk about the consideration. We're asking people to consider that, to understand that, and to make different decisions. Pamela, I want to bring you into the conversation here. What does that look like in practice, and particularly for women who are pregnant? How should courts consider that? What are we asking them to do? Oh, come off mute. Oh, you got to come off mute, Pam.
Sorry about that. Yes, I'm going to start by echoing everyone else, and thank you, commissioners, for us being able to work together. A very diverse group, which is what I feel like makes the recommendations that we have come up with very solid, because we all came from different backgrounds. We all had different perspectives, and we were able to find commonalities of what we felt were important for these front-end recommendations for women. And to your question, Stephanie, what things look like in real lifetime. For me, being a directly impacted woman and having to actually live these experiences, these front-end recommendations hold real significant weight with me. And for myself, along with the women that I represent through my organization, it could be the difference between a good outcome and a very bad outcome. What we do know is that the majority of the women that enter the criminal justice system have sustained some type of abuse, whether it be domestic, sexual, however you. They have endured trauma. And most times with these situations on the front end, coming in contact with officers, it perpetuates harm that has already occurred in a woman's life. And so when we exacerbate that harm, there is not a light that comes on that says rehabilitation. It just signifies more harm, more hurt, more issues. And again, as we've said, not only to that woman, but also her family, the kids that she's leaving behind. And if she's pregnant, the child that she's now holding inside of herself, as was my case. And for me, it ended badly. As Whitney said, 60% of these women are there, have not been convicted yet. They're just being held. And that was my situation. I had not been convicted yet. I was being held and I did not have a bond. So for me, what this looks like in practice is providing alternatives to incarceration for women. And that could be diversion programs, that could be, we have different specialty courts that address different problems, like we have drug court. So for women that we know have a history of substance abuse, drug court could be an answer for them, rather than incarcerating them and not addressing the underlying situation. So more problem-solving courts. There's probation, which would allow that woman to still be able to manage her household, be a mother to her kids. Because also, like Whitney said, we don't ask when a man is arrested where are the kids going, but that is a big issue and a big concern when a woman is arrested. And as Ed said earlier, we're talking about a huge number of kids whose parents are incarcerated, that are not there in the home. And it leads to adverse reactions of those kids. And those kids also themselves a lot of times end up incarcerated as well. But if we're providing alternatives to incarceration where that mother could still be in her home, be a mother to her kids, be present, maintain her household rather than that household come apart and things, are awry, it would, I think, create a better outcome. And we know that from the research that we've seen on these programs. And again, echoing, my fellow commissioners, of reduced recidivism, reductions in substance abuse, increased use of community services, as well as what's most important is family unification, keeping that family together, and to deal with whatever these issues are. Never are we saying that no woman should be held accountable, because in these options, in these alternatives, these women are still being held accountable for whatever the crime is that they have been convicted of, but they're also doing it with harm reduction. They're also doing it by still being able to be present and maintain their families. And considerations for pregnant women are particularly important because we know that there is no carceral facility that can adequately care for all the needs of a pregnant woman, because there are many. There are many needs of a woman, period, just with our reproductive health, issues. And so to layer that with a pregnancy just increases those needs. And also, as Ed said, the cost for that is basically really substantial, and we could reduce those things. So it could be, and again, not to mention that over 80% of these women are in there for nonviolent crimes. So they're not a public safety risk. So there's nothing to hurt by offering an alternative sentencing. But what we need to make this a reality would be prosecutors offering diversion, offering alternative sentencing, offering problem-solving courts, or, these things to make it a reality. Because like I said, in my case, I didn't have a bond. The prosecutor could have given me a bond, and I could have been present to handle my own pregnancy and to be with my family while I was waiting to find out if I would be convicted or not.
Pamela, thank you so much for your leadership in this space and on the commission. You've now brought into the fold prosecutors, the role of prosecutors, and I want to add in legislators to that mix, because some of these things require statutory changes. Well, fortunately, our diverse group of commissioners includes former prosecutors, current prosecutors, and legislators. So Whitney, you wear both of these hats. What does it mean to routinely consider these factors at sentencing and charging decisions? What do we want to see prosecutors and judges do differently here?
Well, you're talking about two of the most stubborn groups of people on the planet. and they have a strong problem with thinking that their solution is the best solution and is the right solution. And so I'll take them in reverse order. I was a legislator most recently, and then I'll talk about prosecutors. But legislators need to hear from people like Pamela, Sheriff Gonzalez, and Courtney. They need to hear the reality of what life's like on the ground for these offenders and for these law enforcement officers, and to understand better all of the factors you've heard each one of the speakers say today about why. And the word consider is so powerful, and it just keeps resonating with me. It is the word that I keep saying over and over again. We need a system that considers these factors. And for too many places and in too many parts of the nation, in Kentucky and everywhere else around the country, uh, you're going to find places where this stuff isn't considered. This information isn't considered. The history of this woman isn't considered. I I'll blame myself. And I wrote about this earlier this year, and you know this, Stephanie, but we were in a meeting earlier this year in Chicago, and we heard from a presenter who's talking about the lives or the lives of women, and she had a timeline up on the slide at one point, and it was just jarring to me. And I've been in the criminal justice system for the better part of 20 years, wearing both of the hats that we've just talked about. And that hit me, such a common sense idea, but it hit me like a ton of bricks to realize that this woman didn't just commit this crime in this moment, but this woman is here because of 1,000 things that have happened to her, or decisions that she's made, or decisions that were made for her by others that she had no control over, that have happened from her birth to now. We're the product of all these things that have happened to us up to that moment, that we are the product of the circumstances we're in. It doesn't mean that there's not a consequence, but it means that you've got to build a system that recognizes and considers all those things, some of which she didn't get to control and she didn't get to have a say in. But they still led her to where she is, because so many of the crimes that women commit are crimes of desperation or crimes of necessity, trying to make ends meet, trying to feed a mouth of a child at home. Um, because of trauma, because of abuse, because of all these things, legislators need to be reminded of those facts. They need to see things like what I saw earlier this year from that presenter in Chicago. They need to see the reality that the system ignores those things. And there's no requirement for the system players like prosecutors and judges and others to consider those things. Outside of a pretrial services officer here in Kentucky, outside of the probation and parole officer who prepares a pre-sentencing investigation report, most other people aren't paying attention to it unless that prosecutor really wants to be involved or that judge really wants to care. And there are some, and there are plenty in different places that do care and do want to know those things, but there are far too many that don't. And so those lawmakers need to remember the system that they have doesn't typically recognize or incentivize the consideration of that. And then for prosecutors, I think policymakers need to make the prosecutors be more intentional in recognizing those things. Pass policies that incentivize using and considering those mitigating factors, those circumstantial factors of the defendant's life, not just the cold court report of all the prior charges they've got. Look at the offender's impact statement. Require an offender's impact statement or a biography or a history of that person. Identify whether there's trauma and what have you. Maybe tie it to funding if you want to be really bold and say that prosecuting offices, because remember, prosecutors in most places, if not every place, are elected. They get to win because they talk about being tough on these criminals and putting bad guys away or bad gals away, and keeping the streets safe and clean for your family and the community and whatever. You've got to make sure that they are incentivized to do what actually does achieve those outcomes in a more effective and proper way. And the best way to do that for this population of human beings is in the community most often, and making sure that we're using evidence-based practices. And in this case, you heard Pamela talk about problem-solving courts, special dockets that are aimed for these specific circumstances or kinds of cases. Make it prosecutorially led. We've got a program in Kentucky right now that's hinges on prosecutors blessing someone getting into a pretrial. Even, I mean, it initiates within a few hours or a couple of days after booking, but getting people into behavioral health. Get those sorts of programs into place that consider these factors so that women aren't run roughshod over by the system as they have been for so many years.
Thank you so much. So we've got about three more topics that I really want to introduce into the mix. I have just a few minutes remaining, so I'm going to do like a speed round here. Courtney, I want to turn to you just because Whitney left off on problem-solving courts. Can you describe what problem-solving courts look like, and how do we address all of these factors? Are they already doing it for women? What would need to be added?
Yeah. One, as you were talking, Whitney, the word, as you talked about, using the word consider, I often think of a couple of words that I think if we could introduce them into our lexicon, would just, continue to make progress, which is what we're talking about is criminal justice responses. There's a range of responses. It's not that there's no response. It's that it's the considerations to create the right response to deliver safety and justice for the community and for the person before, in this case, the court. And really, this is about informed decision making. It's informed decision making. So bringing in those factors and developing a menu of options from early off ramps in the system, as Sheriff Gonzalez talked about, early co-response and sort of early diversion to prosecutor-led diversion to pretrial release to problem-solving courts. It's broadening the menu of options available that and bringing the right data and information for people to make good decisions. This is really informed and good decision making. So really quick, I know you want to quickly. So problem-solving courts. That is one tool. It isn't the only tool. There are, as I said, a range of tools, and our organization is involved in helping stand those up with government, with the court system, with in some jurisdictions it would be probation, pretrial services, the municipality to create again prosecutors, and with the defense bar as well to create this range of responses. I think problem-solving courts, whether it's particularly drug treatment courts, mental health courts as examples, sometimes even domestic violence courts, because they're charged with the domestic violence related offense and may in fact be the victim of domestic violence. All of these problem-solving courts have I think the mandate to, especially as we see more women coming into the system, to examine what the practices are, what the partnerships are with the service providers that exist to ensure that they are responsive to women's unique needs and unique needs and risks. And I can't say that is, I think that's a next generation, frankly, innovation in treatment courts. I think we've done a tremendous job in our nation to make many of these part of sort of the fabric of the criminal justice system in a lot of places. There's a lot more ways to improve them and improve access, but one of those ways I think is specifically looking at how do we create specialized approaches and tailored approaches to the unique needs of women who either are not getting into those courts or are in those courts or in those alternative incarceration programs, and ensuring that what we're doing is effective for their particular needs and risks. So I think our organization is doing some work right now to advance a model, to do some more thinking on that. But that's an area I think ripe for improvement and innovation.
Thank you. And this commission, Courtney, you in particular, but the commission has really been so thoughtful about creating this range of options, a menu of options, recognizing that the capacity jurisdiction to jurisdiction looks different. And we have to have creative ways to respond to people's needs that look different in a small rural jurisdiction where there isn't the capacity for this robust infrastructure of services. I want to shift gears a little bit and come back to you, Sheriff Gonzalez. So the first three recommendations in the report are really focused on stemming this growth of women entering the justice system. But the commission also spent a fair amount of time focused on how do we ensure that women are safe who do come in contact with the justice system. And that led us to the fourth recommendation in the report, which is around prohibiting sexual contact between law enforcement officers and people in their custody. Why did the group feel that this was important, and what supports do police leaders and executives like yourself need to ensure zero tolerance for this type of behavior?
Thank you, Stephanie. We understand, Commissioner members understand that justice-involved women are far more likely than men to have experienced sexual violence and domestic abuse. And we also understand, again, I operate a large corrections facility, is that there is an inherent power imbalance that's inherent in many correctional settings that often will increase the risk for additional abuse and exploitation. And we know that in 2003, under the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, that it prohibits sexual contact between correctional staff and people at our federal, state, and local correctional facilities. But those federal protections do not always reach all times when a person may be under control or custody of the police. And so many states and the federal government have closed some of those gaps in safeguards, but not all have, and they should. And so I think there's an opportunity for police executives, for police departments, to make sure they're adopting zero tolerance policies when it comes to prohibiting sexual contact with individuals that are in custody and their staff.
Great. Thank you so much. Pamela, I want to give you the last word before we open it up for Q&A, and we've got several questions in the pipeline that have come in. Offer us some thoughts on sort of when you think about these recommendations, our first set of recommendations, knowing there are more to come together. If they were to be implemented successfully, robustly across the country, what would the impact be for justice-involved women, for communities, for their families? Oh, come off mute.
Keep forgetting that part. So I think these first set of front-end recommendations are very cohesive. I think they promote safety. I think that they are harm reduction. They limit the number of the amount of trauma to women, minus what they've already been through. I think they're smart recommendations. I think they're evidence-based. We know that they're evidence-based because we did the research first before we even got to creating these recommendations. And again, they come from a diverse group of, as we said, all different types of stakeholders: legislators, prosecutors, sheriffs, directly impacted as myself, community-based leaders that have programs that are running these programs that we have recommended. And so they know that they work because they're running them on a daily basis. So I think if we were able to get these recommendations implemented, I think we would see a reduction of women that are being incarcerated. I think we would see an increase of family unification, of women in the home, and being able to parent their kids and be present for them. I think we would see also the effects of that on these kids, because we also know that we have a rising juvenile population. And I feel like the root of that is contributed to the fact that women are taken out of the homes and these kids don't have that presence. And I think that we would have a safer, a much safer community, safer environment for everyone, and a reduction in the cost of the money that we're spending to keep these women incarcerated.
Thank you so much. Thank you all again for your time on the panel today, for your time in the commission. You are not off the hook yet. In our last bit of time, we're going to open it up for Q&A. Just a reminder to folks, as they've been coming in, type your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible in about the next 10 minutes or so. I want to pick up on the very last thing you said, Pam, with a question around budgets. So we received a question: why should states and cities make these investments in a time of tight budgets and slashed grants? Pam landed there, but Sheriff Gonzalez, you started us on that point around cost savings. Can you say more about why you feel like this is a worthwhile investment in deflection diversion opportunities for women?
Yes, because Generally speaking, research has found that these alternatives to incarceration, reduction in some of the jail population leads to cost savings. And to me, it gives additional resources and opportunities for us to better use those dollars, especially in the tight budgetary situations that we've all experienced. That I've served on Houston City Council before, now as a sheriff dealing with multi-million-dollar budgets. And so dollars are always going to be tight. The grant opportunities sometimes are mixed. Sometimes they're readily available. Other times may not. It's a competitive process as well. So we have to be smart with the dollars we have. And so how can we best maximize and get the best return on investment? Number two, that we're investing in areas that lead to greater success, such as reducing recidivism, and then also long-term, that we're potentially stemming the tide of individuals, those children that may potentially be in future jails if we don't address it now. Because an investment today will help us save money in the long run because we're providing better opportunities, better outcomes for everyone, and we're still keeping our communities safe.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay, we've got another question in related to risk assessments and pretrial. And so, Courtney, I'm going to ask you to take this one. Can you tell us more about the risk assessment process? How do courts determine somebody's risks and needs? And the question is that presumably this requires some resources, coordination, and what does that look like in practice?
Yeah. Well, as all things in this country, it depends on where you are. We're not, one criminal justice system as a nation and even as a state, and in various states. So, to just give you a flavor, here in New York, New York has an unusual bail statute that actually doesn't require consideration of public safety. It's only risk of flight. So we're unusual in that case. And really where it would come to then a determination around how to create, if someone is released to our supervised release program, for example, the assessment of what their needs are and what their risks are in order to keep them from, not coming back to court and ensuring that they're safe in the community and providing safety. We're doing that within our program on the sort of back end. So they have already been mandated to supervise release, and it is based on an assessment that is really more about the charge and what the charge is, their criminal history. There's a sort of an assessment made by the court at that time to determine whether this is someone appropriate for pretrial supervision and what level of supervision. But the nature of that supervision is really determined by our team in terms of the types of voluntary supports and supervision tactics that we're using to support that person. In other jurisdictions, folks are using hopefully an evidence-based tool. The kind of pretrial version of the women's risk need assessment is a great one that is used, again, often in when someone is put into either they're being assessed for consideration of pretrial release or as part of their developing their supervision and support program, or sort of what the nature of that would be, is informed by what we hope is a validated risk needs assessment, of which there are some on the market and available. Others, people are, a best practice would be to either use those and validate them locally, or if for whatever reason operationally it doesn't make sense to use some of those off-the-shelf models, to develop something that you can evaluate and test with a research partner, a university or some other researcher that is helping to essentially give you those factors that you're using to determine, again, what level of supervision and what is the nature of services available. We've seen it administered by sometimes it's court-related staff, sometimes it's probation or pretrial services. In our case, we're using, it's a nonprofit organization that is working as a with a government contract in order to provide that kind of supervision. So there are a number of kind of places, depending on the jurisdiction and how things work there, to insert this tool and use it appropriately to ensure that we're, again, not introducing kind of more harm or more supervision than is needed, but making sure that we're targeting the right kinds of services and support and supervision that are needed to be effective in ensuring that person hopefully, returns and can resolve their case, but also to protect public safety in most jurisdictions.
That's great. Thank you so much. And something Courtney lifted up is sort of like you've been in one place, it looks so different place to place. And there are so many innovative models happening across the country. The research really needs to keep up or catch up to the amount of innovation that's in place. And that was a common thread throughout the work of the commission, is that we need more data on women's experiences. We need better research on their outcomes and how they move through these programs, what things work better in terms of increasing of court appearance rates for women. Do the same types of strategies that we know work well for men work as well for women, or are there other strategies? These questions were largely unanswered. And so we've used the best available research. We've commissioned new research, but just a strong encouragement to the field to continue to innovate and evaluate the interventions that you're exploring, including gender responsive risk assessment instruments, to ensure that we're not overclassifying women by using tools that haven't been validated by sex. Okay, let's see, a couple more minutes for questions. Here's one about public safety. Okay, Whitney, I'm going to turn this one to you. We are hearing so much about crime in major cities these days. How do these proposals impact public safety?
Well, it's a great question. First, I would direct you to a new resource, or it's relatively new, called the Real-Time Crime Index. You can check that out to see that the crime rate around the country is actually dropping. You can find specific instances where it's not, but that's an excellent resource that's freely available, and I think it's actually realtimecrimeindex.com or .org maybe. But in any event, all these policies improve public safety, and you've heard from each of the speakers talking about why. Think about what happens when a woman gets arrested. It's a crime of necessity or a crime of desperation. She's the mother of a couple of kids, a single parent, sole breadwinner for her household. You've taken a criminal offender off the street, but in the process, and let's say she's one of the 60% that's sitting there pretrial and just can't afford to make bail. She stole something or committed some other offense because she didn't have the money to feed her kids. She's sitting there pretrial, and you can feel good, I guess, about that particular person being in custody, but you've done now a harm to those children, and that might result in future criminal actions or court actions for sure. You're creating a lot of downstream effects that are negative and harmful. I see as a prosecutor, I remember prosecuting people whose father had been in court a generation before, or whose mother had been in court a generation before. And if you think those sorts of generational things don't take place, you're fooling yourself. And those sorts of harms are real. These interventions, these sorts of recommendations are all aimed at trying to make sure that the system preserves public safety, but keeps people that don't need to be in custody back where they can do the most good. They can get the most help. They can get the behavioral health or substance use issues that they need addressed, and they can do that more meaningfully and more effectively without being behind bars. Frankly, it frees up resources too. It frees up resources that can be spent on those sorts of behavioral health interventions and other community-based programming and supports and pretrial services and supervision, instead of just keeping them locked up in the county jail for what ends up being months or perhaps a year or so at a time. You're avoiding a lot more harm by front loading services for these folks, these women, and building a system that considers the backgrounds that brought them to where they are. there are, I didn't mention it, and one of the other speakers may have mentioned it. Remember, we're talking about a population of people that are, because women, they're less likely to reoffend, they're less likely to commit violent crimes, they're less likely to commit crimes in the first place. They consistently score as a lower risk on risk and needs assessments. These are solutions that are aimed at just the right population. They need to be out and providing for their families and taking care of things and not sitting in jail.
Whitney, or Stephanie, can I just jump in to also add that it then means you're freeing up resources for the people who are higher, who are
That's right.
high risk, who are the people that are a threat, who are the people that our system needs to be paying attention to. In that respect, as Sheriff Gonzalez said, we only have a certain number of dollars. How are we going to use those effectively?
Right on.
And I just want to, as you said, Whitney, it's both about reducing and the need around, what women's incarceration, but also it gives us the system the opportunity and the mandate to focus on the people who should be the focus.
Great,
Preach it.
thank you for that. Okay, we have time for just one more question, and Pamela, I'm going to direct this one to you. It's a big question with lots of parts to it, but I'm going to focus in on one piece, which is around the type of input that the commission received from women with lived experience throughout the process. And really, we named many times the lack of data that captures that experience, which is so often what we rely on. So how have we thought about that, and how do we engage with women with lived experience as we're considering what recommendations to prioritize?
So, as a commissioner and having lived experience myself, my voice has always been in the room, it's always led in the room. We were not pushed to the side, we were not absent, we were not silent. There are a ton of recommendations that we looked at. There was a lot of information that we had to cover. And as a directly impacted woman, trust me, I brought up all of the issues, all of the layers. I did not leave anything behind. But based on the fact that we understand that we're not able to address everything, we pulled out the top 4 of the recommendations that we felt would be the most effective, that would the solutions that we were looking for on the front end was to downsize the number of women that are entering the system. And we felt like these 4 recommendations would achieve that goal of reducing the number of women that are arrested, that are introduced to the system on the front end. It was challenging to do because a lot of the things that came up and a lot of the things that I have mentioned that are issues for women that are incarcerated, we don't have the data on, like cost was a big thing. And then a lot of the data that we had not been aggregated to say, of this data, how much of this is men, how much of this is women. So there was a lot of work that we had to do in digging and being creative and innovative to get the information that we needed to support these recommendations, because it's very important that these recommendations be taken seriously. And on that note, we understand that most people want to see quantitative data to support anything that's being recommended or anything that's being suggested. And so we have done the work and the due diligence of digging in and coming up with as much as that data that we could find to support these 4 recommendations with what we have that's limited, that's out there. And we are still creating more questions that we are researching and trying to dig in and dive and get the data around to support the work that we still have left going forward.
Thank you, Pamela.
Stephanie.
Oh, yes.
Just real quick, I just want to say, in addition to Pamela's incredible feedback of her lived experience, we also visited with individuals with lived experience in Tulsa, for example, and learned how community-based organizations have positively impacted them, as well as a corrections facility in Cook County, where we met directly with incarcerated persons that gave us, again, tremendous feedback and perspective.
Yep, thank you for including that. That is all the time that we have for today. We could talk for so much longer on this. I know we have more questions in the queue. I want to thank you again to our panelists for this thoughtful discussion, for your leadership in this space and on the commission. Thank you to everyone who joined for the discussion today, and for those of you who posed questions. Just want to recap by saying the commission feels strongly that women are no less responsible for their actions than men. But as we learn what drives women to criminal behavior, we have this opportunity to provide more tailored, responsive interventions that can reduce crime and create pathways to stability. We encourage you to stay in touch with us, to continue to engage with the work of the Women's Justice Commission, with the work of the Council more broadly. We welcome follow-up questions and outreach to our team about how we can partner to push this work forward. And as you heard here today, with all these diverse perspectives around the table, we at the Council refuse to believe that we can't find common ground on some of the most pressing issues facing our nation. Thank you all so much for your time today.